Dzień dobry. It's more or less the last word I remember from Gdańsk 35 years ago. But I have a lot of emotion today. I should start with Mr. Marshall, Mrs. Minister, and so on. I deeply thank you for being here. But I want to say, ladies and gentlemen, and dear friends, it's with a lot of emotion that I am going to talk tonight, because 35 years ago, I would never have imagined that today we would be discussing like we are in such a wonderful new center, and trying not only to speak about the past, but also about future. And this is what I'm going to do tonight. The idea is to discuss challenges for democracy today. In the 60s, in the 70s, there were dissidents that manifested an unusual and wonderful courage in a certain number of situations in the Soviet Union or in other countries, and they were acting alone, usually, or very individually. In Poland, very differently, it was a total social movement that was taking shape as a combination, excuse me, yes, excuse me. I have to read my paper in English, which is not my natural language, so excuse me. So, in Poland, we had a total social movement. This is what I wanted to discuss with Bogdan. And this movement was the conjunction, the articulation, not the fusion, but the articulation of three forces that united led to the creation of Solidarity. A democratic, peace-supporting movement fueled not only, but also by intellectuals. The manifestations of a national and Catholic identity, which had at that time its culminating expression with the beginning of John Paul II papacy. And finally, a real social workers' movement here, the shipyards. Most of us can remember the movie by Andrzej Wajda, but also there is a lot of books and articles that explain all this. So, 35 years ago, an historical accord, or I should say historical accords, were reached. And this accord has a world importance because they were saying something that today we must recognize. They meant the end of communism, which was such a big event. So at that time, in the Western capitalist world where I was living, democracy did not appear so much as a problem or something that should be discussed. Democracy, 35 years ago, was just the opposite, or the negation of communism. It was the good against evil. It was freedom, as was said, against repression. And when people wanted to discuss the notion of democracy, usually they started and ended with a very famous quotation by Winston Churchill, who said that democracy, he said that in 1947, democracy, he said, is the worst form of government except all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. So, to say differently, in the early 80s, political philosophy was not working so much in order to try to say something new about democracy. A few years after, as we all know, it was the Berlin Wall that fell. And an American political or philosophical scientist, Francis Fukuyama, announced the end of history. He published a very famous article in 1989, and then a book where he explained, and I quote him, "What we may be witnessing is not the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such, that is, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. Today, there are still a certain number of brutal, authoritarian, totalitarian, dictatorial regimes in the world. But these regimes don't have any support within democratic countries, which was not the case in the 60s or in the 70s, when the ideas of violence, when some versions of Marxism, speaking of the dictatorship of the proletariat, found some support in the West. So maybe some people will consider that Fukuyama's prophecy came true, that democracy triumphed, that revolution, violence, radical Islam have come to be seen as pathological phenomenon practically all over the world. But, and here I will really begin this lecture, can we be sure of the victory and success of liberal democracy? Almost 35 years after the agreement in this city, an important phenomenon emerges. Democracy has begun to manifest numerous limitations and has become problematic in itself. For many people, democracy cannot longer propose itself as a unique, solid alternative to other political regimes. It reveals imperfections, difficulties, losses, limitations, while at the same time it presents its ability of self-transgression and of finding answers to problems in itself. So what I would like to do tonight is to present some of these problems, because of course I will defend the idea of democracy, but we should take seriously a certain number of problems. A first problem is the relationship between liberal democracy and unemployment. As we know, in Western countries, the Cold War coincided with a 30 years period of intensive economic growth based on Ford and Taylor industrial models, models which mobilized not only qualified workers, but also lots of unqualified workers. But in the mid-70s, and not only because of the oil crisis of 1973, this model started to show first symptoms of exhaustion. The fall of industrial society began together with the rise of what had been at that time called a post-industrial society. At the same time, unemployment began to pose a threat even to the most affluent countries, and it did so in a completely new way. For a number of reasons, the problem of unemployment appeared as one of having a structural character. And we could see in many societies that the collective existence was divided, that two groups emerged: those who still continued to work, to develop, and those who were abandoned, who were supporting exclusion or, in the best cases, precarious situations. And governments began not to be able to find solutions. Industrial eras, suburbs, entire cities became the scenes of difficulties, sometimes violence, sometimes ghetto turned into ghetto. Apparently, no satisfactory democratic therapy could be proposed or found. And this is maybe the first weakness of democracy. And today, after the 2008 crisis, it is clear that we did not finish with this difficulty. Maybe also, this helps us to understand why in post-Soviet countries, there sometimes remain a kind of nostalgia for the time of the allegedly free access to labor market, food, education, and so on. When economic needs are not satisfied, a group of voters might seek authoritarian rule from which they expect they will benefit economically or symbolically. This is also connected sometimes with powerful nationalistic sentiments that we can observe in Russia and in some other countries, of course. And this is also why sometimes some active homophobia, anti-Semitism, hatred against minorities, and I should add today fear of migrants and disinterest from migrants can develop. So this is maybe the first weakness or the first challenge for democracy today. I would like now to say a few words about the second challenge, which is a relationship between liberal democracy and what we could call cultural and religious minorities. In the theoretical analysis, when people deal with the idea of liberal democracy, it is not too difficult to propose ideas for individuals' rights and duties. It is much more difficult to deal with collective identities, ethnic identities, religious, cultural, national identities. These identities did not disappear. On the contrary, some people believe that they were disappearing, but in all our countries, they are growing. For instance, democracy is not prepared to solve tensions and to react when they have to face demands of independence from a part of a country. A national state can hardly tolerate the loss of a portion of the territories that has been recognized as its property. I must say that it is true that David Cameron's government, on the one hand, and the proponents of Scottish independence, on the other hand, to take an example, have handled this issue of autonomy or independence in a perfectly democratic manner at that stage. But usually, many other experiences show that when independence is at stake for a part of a country, then violence is not so far. And we have known so many experiences of that kind. That's the first aspect of this challenge of national identity, of identities within a state. In the late 60s, in Canada, and then in many other countries all over the world, the democratic thought began to be fueled by a new debate. It was a debate on minorities, which has been called sometimes a debate on multiculturalism. And it is a very, very important debate. Is it possible to develop, to implement legal and institutional solutions that will be at the same time able to meet the expectations of recognition put forward by minorities, cultural, ethnic, religious, and at the same time not to let the rules of liberal democracy being undermined? Is it possible? A positive answer to this question, which is a philosophical question, but also a very concrete political question, requires, from my point of view, to reconcile two issues which for many people seem completely irreconcilable. On the one hand, we have to promote universal values, the rights of human beings to be citizens, to be individuals, to be subjects, personal subjects. And on the other hand, respect or recognition for identities. Is it possible to articulate, to conciliate individualism and collective identities in a democracy? I think it is, theoretically and concretely. Theoretically, I think that it is possible to accommodate individual identities and universally values of law and reason. If you read, for instance, a very important political philosopher from Canada, Will Kimlicka, you will find very interesting proposals on what he calls a liberal multiculturalism. In English, liberal means dealing with individuals. So multiculturalism is for collective identities and liberal for individualism. And practically, in many situations where the official discourse is far from any official recognition of minorities, in the real life, locally, people are able to find solutions. I remember a recent exchange which I had with a mayor of a city in France who is also a member of the parliament, who told me, when I am at the parliament, I only defend universal values, law, reason, the same for everybody. But in my city, he's the mayor of Sarcelles, some of you may know this city. In my city of Sarcelles, one day I have to deal with a Jewish minority, another day I have to deal with Christians from Syria and Iraq. There are a number of people like that in this city. Another day I have to deal with people coming from North Africa and so on. And they have specific demands, and I try to do my best to give positive answers to these people. So theoretically and practically, it is possible to avoid to have to choose between, on the one hand, a pure individualistic liberalism, and on the other hand, a dangerous communitarianism. It is possible to find intermediary options, not to be only liberal or not only communitarian. I use here the vocabulary which specialist experts use. But it is not so easy to do it in the real life, in the political life, and this is the second challenge for democracy that I wanted to present to you. There is now a third challenge which I would like to introduce, which we could call the limits of political representation. 1 century ago, more or less, Robert Michels, who was a very important sociologist, social scientist, a friend of Max Weber, explained in what became a very classical book that liberal democracies rely on the principle of political representation, which in turn depends on the party system. And Michels stressed the importance of what he called the iron law, according to which each institution, including party institution, is inevitably transformed into an oligarchy. But today the problem is different, I think. The problem is the exhaustion of political systems in many liberal democracies. Today, it's only a few countries in the Western world which can really say that they have avoided the crisis of political representation, that is to say, the crisis of those systems that were organized with a classical division between the left and the right. I come from a country where this is a huge phenomenon, but I'm sure that Poland has also some difficulties from that point. So what happens is that when you have a political system which does not work well, big dangers appear. The first one, of course, is those political forces that will appear out of the system. These forces usually concentrate around the radical right. It may also appear on the radical left. And it may also appear in a kind of populist and amorphous way, which will combine elements coming from the right discourse and elements coming from the left. It is, from my point of view, the case in Italy with the so-called Five Stars movement of Beppe Grillo. It's not right, it's not left, it's a mixture of both, and it's a very populist discourse. So, this is the first danger that democracy have to face, how to face these tendencies that are strong all over the world, and we're in a European center, and in Europe, maybe much more than in other parts of the world. There is a second problem for democracy. It is that when we have this crisis of the political systems, many people decide not to vote anymore, political abstention. In the past, political abstention could be connected with the fact that some people are not educated, they are very marginal, they are very poor, and so on. But today, political abstention has a political meaning. It means it's a deliberate political action. They say, I don't find any political offer that is good from my point of view. And this problem of political abstention, including very educated people, could lead to a very important other problem, which we could call post-democracy. Some people would say post-political era. That is to say, in some situation, we can imagine that there is no problem with citizen rights, with freedom for opinion, freedom for expression, and so on. The speech the speech right, there is absolutely no doubt about it, but people are no longer interested in politics. And politics is a kind of business for political people, journalists, and some experts in surveys, polls, and gallops, this kind of such. And so this is a very important danger. Colin Crout, a political scientist in England, called this post-democracy, which is to say, we are not against all these values, but we don't do anything with the values of voting, exerting the right to vote, and this kind of thing. So, at that stage, we could have the feeling that we have big dangers for democracy. But I would like not to be only negative or pessimistic. I would like to introduce some more optimistic perspectives on this precise point, at least. In some countries, we see that the political system are sometimes able to renew themselves, to revive themselves. I will just give the example of Spain, not to say that I am in favor or against such or such party. But look at Spain. Recently, we have two classical forces, the People's Party and the Spanish Socialist Workers' Parties, that are trying to modify their behavior because they observe the birth of two new political forces. On the one hand, Podemos, left, on the other hand, Ciudadanos, on the right. Which means that new forces may appear and oblige a whole political system to some transformations. Maybe this new dynamic will stop tomorrow, I don't know. But at least there is something new that appears in a country like Spain. But much more interesting from my point of view is the idea that political representation is not enough, that we need other forms of democracy, not against political representation, but in order to improve political or to help political representation. And this is why many people have a strong interest, for instance, for the Brazilian experience that started not far from 25 years ago in Porto Alegre, in Brazil, which is called Participatory Budget. That is to say, the population is able to deal with some aspect of the local budget, and also that we have many experiences where people discuss in order to prepare some decision, and this, in the philosophical debate, is called participatory or deliberative democracy, which is an important subject of debate, but also sometimes there is some practice. That is to say, not only political representation, but also new forms of democracy where people participate in the decision or in the analysis of a problem, not only when there are elections, but to discuss, for instance, some issues. And this is interesting. Maybe people could also consider with some interest other forms of democracy which are not connected directly with political representation. And here I would like to say a word about direct democracy. If you go to Swiss, for instance, to Switzerland, you will see that there are what they call votations, and popular initiatives. So you can decide, there is a system that makes it possible for the people to decide that they want a vote for something. Do we agree on new mosque in the countries? Or this kind of thing. So what I want to say here, this does not solve all the participatory or deliberative democracy, direct democracy don't solve all the problem, but they introduce the possibility of new engagement, of new political activities, even if it is difficult to organize, even if it is also sometimes dangerous. But so the difficulties, I have no time to be more precise, but there are some difficulties. If you want to have more of this kind of new democracy, it means that everybody should be able to participate. So everybody should receive knowledge, information. Communication should be possible between many people, which internet makes much more possible than in the past. But this also can lead to severe abuses or misconducts or awful things. You can have people that say we want a vote connected with hatred, connected with dirty ways of dealing with important issues. This is also democracy. And we know also how, that it is not so easy to develop these forms of democracy. So this was my third challenge. I would like to introduce another challenge, which is this problem. What do we do? Well, we could call it limits to the sovereignty of the people. What do we do when the people become racist, when the people become xenophobic, when the people want an authoritarian regime? It is not a new question. When you discuss this kind of issue, some people will say, well, it is true that Adolf Hitler was elected, and not only coming through with violence. So this is also a challenge for democracy. How can we be sure that democracy is articulated with a certain number of values that make possible to avoid popular decisions that lead to awful situations? I just wanted to say that this is a real problem, and I say that because in my country, and it is not the case only in my country, we are in a situation where an extreme right party could tomorrow, through elections, become president and have a majority and so on the government and govern the country. I would like to say a very few words about another challenge for democracy, which is not so easy to deal with. This challenge is when a big threat is coming either from abroad, either from within the society, through the main form of terrorism. What happens every time that you have this kind of problem is always the same. The government says, we need more power in order to face with more efficiency this big threat that everybody agrees to face. So the government will ask less independence for justice, less independence for the legislative power, and more capacity to act for the executive power. And it's difficult to say, no, we don't want this, because if you say we don't want this, it means, you are in favor of terrorism. You don't want us to fight against terrorism as we should. So I say that because in the United States, as you know, after 9/11 in 2001, after this terrorist attack, they decided to have the Patriot Act, which is the contrary of democracy, but which was considered as necessary in this country. And in my country, after what happened in January recently, 6 months ago, we are having a new legislation that gives more power to the executive power and less power to the justice, to the judicial, and to the legislative power. This is also a challenge to democracy, a big challenge. Can we accept this or not? A last point maybe, yes, it will be my last point, is to try and see that in the world, the space of issues, of problems, is not the space of political action. That today, some important issues exist at a world level or at a regional level, while the capacity to deal politically with this issue exists only or mainly at the state or national level. I know that you received in this city 2 or 3 years ago Ulrich Beck, the German sociologist who died 6 months ago. He said it with a wonderful expression. He said, with two wonderful expressions. He said, we must finish with with methodological nationalism. That is to say, to analyze and to think everything within the framework of the nation state. For instance, a big risk today is a world risk. Climate change is not a question only for France or for Poland or for such or such country. It's a world issue. Terrorism is global. Nuclear plants are a risk for many countries and not only for the country where they exist and so on. And so the first expression that he used, methodological nationalism, to criticize it, is we must find ways to think at a world level, at a global level, even if we know that the political capacity to deal with issues is mainly national, or should be mainly national for many people. And Ulrich Beck used more recently another expression. He said, we are living an era of cosmopolitization of the world. He does not say we all are cosmopolitan people. This is not at all his idea. He said cosmopolitization, which means every person, every individual knows or should know that his or her life has something to do with global logics, global problems, global issues. We are in a world that we are not only living locally. Today we are in Gdańsk. If something happens in Gdańsk, it will, if it is important, it will have world repercussions. Maybe this was the case 35 years ago. And so there is a very important problem, which is that we have to invent forms of democracy that make possible to deal with global challenges within societies where the nation-state level is still very important. I don't have time to develop this point, but I think it is very important. So, these are a certain number of challenges. Maybe I should, in this place, add a last one. 35 years ago, there was a very important dimension of social movement, social conflict in what was done. Today, in many countries, we don't see so much social conflicts, social movements. And sometimes what we see are the contrary, what we could call anti-social movements. In my country, I don't see any social movements that I could compare with Solidarity, but I see many anti-social movements, hatred, racism, and so on. And so maybe a last challenge for democracy could be that democracy is stronger when we have social movements and not when we don't have social movements, and that in situations when we don't have social movements, when we don't have this kind of conflictuality, it is more difficult to improve, to implement democracy. I gave a few minutes ago the example of Spain. I told you 2 new parties appeared, Podemos and Ciudadanos. This was possible because 2 or 3 years before, a social movement had developed in Spain, which is called Indignados, which means sometimes more democracy, more political life is possible because you have more conflicts and more social movement, which is maybe not so much the case today. So to conclude, I understood that it's not the moment to have too many souvenirs, but I just want to give you one of my souvenirs of this city. I was in September 1981 invited. I was very proud. You don't imagine how proud I was. I was the only foreign person invited as an expert for the Congress of Solidarity. I was very proud. And I remember many moments, but there was one moment which I want to quote now. This Congress, Moscow called it in the journal, in the newspapers, an anti-socialist and anti-communist orgy. It was an orgy. I liked that. So for me, it was an orgy of democracy. And I remember a moment when Lech Wałęsa, at the moment when he was going to be chosen as chairman of Solidarity, he said, we need a vote, and we need a real vote. And he showed ballot boxes that were empty, just like that. Said, look, they are empty, we are going to vote, which was the contrary of what was usually the case in this country before. And then he said, yes, it will take time, it's costly, it's difficult because, well, we have so many things to discuss, but we must do this, and democracy is good, even if it is costly, even if it takes time. And I think he was absolutely right. Democracy is not easy. Democracy takes time. It is clear that we have today a certain number of big challenges, and I could have had a certain number of other challenges. But 30 years after the birth of Solidarity, I think we should still try, or we should try to invent new progress for this notion that is now a notion that belongs to us, to the society in which we live, and that we must absolutely develop if we don't want the chaos, the authoritarian regimes, the violence, and so many things like that. So thank you for your patience, and let me tell you again that I have a lot of emotion today. Thank you.